Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Bell.
I hope I can live up to that great introduction, and thanks for inviting me to talk to you all. So as you've just heard, we can only make smart choices based on things that are actually true. If we make decisions based on things which are not true, then we end up either not improving them or making things worse. And so that's why it's important to me as a scientist, as an independent scientist, who spent 3,000 hours reading 3,000 scientific articles, unpaid, to find out what's really true so that we can start making wiser choices. And that's what I'm going to show to you today. So what have we heard about plastics? First of all, we're drowning in plastics. That's what we hear. Plastic waste is taking over the world. We should replace plastics with other materials. That's what we're being told. Plastics are causing litter. They're going into the ocean. They're harming the turtles. And we're eating a credit card worth of plastic a week. That's what we're hearing in the media. And we're hearing that the plastic pipes, PVC pipes and polyethylene pipes are not green and we shouldn't be using them and they're not safe. So we've heard all this stuff, and I wouldn't be here if any of that stuff was true because I wouldn't have anything to talk about. I'm going to fact check all of this, and I'm going to go through, I'm going to show you the science. Every single thing I'm going to say is going to be backed with peer-reviewed science. You're going to see the citations to that science, which I can provide copies of. And everything I say is also going to be in inverted commas, literally copied and pasted from those studies with no spin, because that's how proper scientists act. Why am I the person to do this? Partly because I'm the only one stupid enough to spend that much time unpaid to read that much stuff. And the main reason was my daughters were being taught lies at school. I pay a lot of property tax for my kids to go to a good school district, and I was highly unamused to find out that they were told nonsense like the plastics don't degrade and things like that. And then I realized, well, the teachers don't know any better, so I went off on this little quest to go and read all the science and find out whether these things are true or whether they're not true. And so I'm a leading independent plastic materials expert, as told for Procter & Gamble and Lego and many other companies. They come to me for revolutionary new materials. I have a keen interest in pipes, actually, so I had some good discussions on that. So the first thing is, we get our information from social media these days, but studies have shown that most of what we read on social media is nonsense. So a lie is 70% more likely to be repeated than the truth. And why is that? Because lies are exciting, right? When you're lying, you can make up anything. If you're telling the truth, you're very confined in what you can say. The truth is more boring than lies, and so lies take over, they spread virally, and everyone believes them because no one's checking the facts anymore. And a study has proven that all you have to do is repeat a lie enough times and people will believe it. So that's how politicians and other people are operating now. They just say the same nonsense again and again. And even if you have a high IQ, that is not a defense against this illusory truth effect where you just keep repeating something that's nonsense and after a while it sounds sensible. So here's a slide. We hear a lot about bans, banning plastics. Why should we ban this material? Well, it's 25% of household waste, massive contributor to landfills, much of it single use, huge amounts of CO2, less green than the alternatives, limited recyclability, full of chemicals, degrades to microparticles, thousands of years to decompose. Except for this slide is not about plastics, this is about paper. And the point of this slide is to point out that if anyone believed any of this stuff, they would be twice as much against paper as they are against plastic. Because 25% of household waste is paper, but it's only 13% plastic. Paper is twice as bad, but nobody cares, because people think that paper is natural, which it isn't. And they think it's cozy and they give it a pass. Massive contribute to landfills. Twice as much paper goes to landfill. Much of paper is zero use, and I'm talking about that spam. 90% of these letters you get go right in the trash can. They never get read. They go directly to the trash can. We're talking of trillions and trillions of letters every year, zero use. Taken right from your letterbox, put right in the trash. Much worse than single use, and nobody cares about it because it's paper. It's made of chemicals and toxins. It can take thousands of years to decompose. And we know that because we have things which are thousands of years old, pieces of paper, and you can still read them. So this is just to give you an idea that we are making irrational decisions about things which are not really true. If we were really worried about any of these things, we would be focused on paper, but we're not. So it's just kind of a wake-up call. Are we drowning in plastic? Let's look at that. So I was literally shocked to be reading a book. I turned over the page, and I won't say I fell off my chair, but I was close to it because I realized, reading this book, that plastics are about 1% of the materials we use. And you could almost stop the talk here, because anyone who thinks that we can solve the world's problems by obsessing over 1% of it and ignoring the other 99% is literally insane, right? There's no way. I'm a professional problem solver. That's what I do for a living. There's no way to solve a problem by ignoring 99% of it. If we were really worried about materials, we wouldn't be obsessing over 1% and ignoring everything else. And I check this number because I always check everything. So I went and found other sources and more up-to-date sources, which are cited here, like on every slide. And what we find out is this number is actually too high. Plastics are 0.4% by weight of materials we use and less than 1% by volume. So if people really were worried about using too much material, they would not be focused just on plastic. They'd be looking at this other 99.5%, but they're not. What about waste? Are we drowning in plastic waste? This is very hard to get a number for, but the most accurate number we can get is the same. 0.4% of waste by weight is plastic. And people talk about household waste, which I just mentioned. That's 13 to 15% of household waste is plastic, according to the EPA. But what I didn't know when I wrote the book is that household waste is only 3% of overall waste. The other 97% is industrial waste from mining and so forth. So it turns out that plastic is only a very, very small proportion of the overall waste as well, which makes sense. If plastic is less than 1% material, it makes sense that it would be less than 1% of waste as well. And is plastic increasing waste? And the answer is no. Waste over the decades, you can see this is waste per person and total household waste. This is from the EPA. You can still find it on their website. Copied and pasted this whole graph. So it used to increase linearly over the decades, and then suddenly it went flat. So per person, we're not making any more waste than we used to, and the overall waste has also leveled out. And scientists wondered, how come we're getting richer? How come we're using all this stuff, and yet somehow this waste has leveled off? So they studied the data and found out the reason is plastics. Over this period, here, where plastic was introduced and scaled up, plastic use increased 84 times over these decades because it started from zero, right? So in the beginning, you've got a huge increase rate, starts with infinity, and it goes, 80 times, 50 times, and so forth, because it's a new material starting from nothing. And at the same time as plastic was increasing, the use of all these other materials went down because on average, it takes 1 pound of plastic to replace 3 or 4 pounds of other materials like metal or glass or paper. So although plastic materials use was dramatically increasing, and that's what people saw, they perceived this great increase in the use of plastic, it was actually reducing overall waste and materials use because it's so efficient at replacing the other materials. So it's not fair to say that plastics are taking over dramatically. And another thing to say is that plastic materials use, you always hear that it's growing and it's going exponential, it's going to double by 2050. And that's not fair to say either, because all materials are increasing at about 3% a year. Metal and wood and glass and paper and plastic are all increasing the use at 3% a year. So to criticize plastic for increasing at the same rate as every other material is illogical and unfair as well. But that's what these green groups are doing all the time. Here's a graph of, or a map of where waste comes from, and you can see that the countries that are prosperous are making a lot more waste. So you can see it's shaded dark, all the dark shadings, like America, for example, is where a lot of waste happens. And this is a natural consequence of prosperity, right? When you get rich and you have a good lifestyle, you generate more waste. It's not necessarily a bad thing. What's bad is when you don't manage it properly. And that's what we see on the next graph. The next map shows you which countries are mismanaging the waste. And you can see America is not doing it, right? The amount of mismanaged waste from America or Europe is very, very low because they're responsible in how they handle their waste. But that's not what the green groups are telling us. They want us to feel guilty about polluting the oceans and about mismanaging waste. And why do they want us to feel guilty for something we're not doing? Because we have money. There's no point going to some guy in a hut in Africa and saying, hey, give me your money, because these are the people who are actually creating the waste, because they can't donate to Greenpeace and the World Wildlife Fund. There's no point to hit up a poor person for money, right? So that's why they're guilt-tripping us to feel guilty about something that we never did. So should we be replacing plastics? And a very famous economist said, when you hear about a proposal, you should ask yourself 3 questions. Compared to what? How much will it cost? And where's the evidence? And those are some of the questions we're going to be asking today. We're going to look at evidence, and we're going to be comparing to the other alternatives, because everything creates an impact. The question is it less impact or more impact than the other things we could be choosing instead? Here's a life cycle analysis, and this is something where you start off with so we're talking about a part here, like a part or a car, for example. We start off with how much raw materials does it take to make this car? What about manufacturing the car, transporting the car, the lifetime of the car, driving it around turns out to be 90% of the impact. Only about 10% of making a car is the actual raw materials. Then you have repairs of the car, disposal. Life cycle analysis looks at all of this, and not just the carbon dioxide. It looks at toxins, carbon dioxide, energy used, water used, acid rain, toxicity, eutrophication, that's where you run out of oxygen in your rivers and lakes and the fish die, and waste. So all of these things are incorporated in a modern LCA, and this is standardized so you can't cheat. So you can't just go around and make up your own numbers. This is the only way to know what's green. So some people say to me, well, I don't like life cycle analysis, I don't believe in it. Well, then you're down to flipping a coin to decide what's green, which is not a great way of doing things. This has been used for decades. All the governments use it, the companies use it, and so forth. It's the only logical way to make choices. And it's been fine-tuned for ages. And so when I started looking into this, I went and found all these life cycle analyses to find out what they say. Here's a recent study by McKinsey. They looked at 14 different applications of materials where you could use plastic or metal or glass or paper, and they compared them. And in 13 of the 14 cases, they found that plastic was massively greener than the alternatives, saving up between 10 and 90, so averages 50% on average saving of greenhouse gas, and all the other factors as well, not just greenhouse gas. So 13 out of 14 cases, plastic was greenest. And I did an even bigger study. I looked at 50 different life cycle analyses. There are 28 studies on bags in the world. We're talking about Canada and Sweden and Denmark and America and so forth. Every study ever done anywhere in the world says that the plastic bag, the polyethylene bag, is wildly greener than the alternatives. It weighs, the Kroger bag from the store where I go to is 6 grams. Their paper bag is 60 grams. Who wants to pick something that's more water, more chemicals, more greenhouse gas, and 10 times more waste? Doesn't make any sense. And yet, this is what politicians are doing. They're banning or taxing the proven greenest solution according to every study ever done. That's how bad this misinformation campaign is. If we look at packaging, and what I mean there is like mailer envelopes, it's the same thing. Plastic wins over these other materials. Straws, the greenest straw is just don't take a straw, right? That's obvious. The second greenest is take a plastic one and reuse it. I found 13 or 14 studies on pipes, and plastic comes out to be the greenest every single time, apart from one, which we'll see later on. Banknotes, same thing. Textiles, containers, and by that I mean like perfume bottles and cosmetics containers, little jars of stuff like that, face cream and things like that. Plastic wins every time there. The only time that plastic loses is to a hunk of wood. If you can make something out of a chunk of wood, that's usually greener than polyethylene and polypropylene and PVC. We often hear that plastics are bad because oil is used to make plastics. But if you look at the total pie chart of what happens to a barrel of oil, you find out that 85% of it is burned instantly. We've got no problem burning it for heating, for gasoline, for diesel, for kerosene, for aircraft. No problem. Let's just take this oil right out of the ground and burn it. We create carbon dioxide. Nobody blinks. Nobody cares. And then suddenly we use 5% of it to make plastic. And that, whoa, 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 hang on a minute. What's going on with all of that oil usage? Right? It's completely illogical. And when you look at the numbers, you find that 5% of oil is used to make plastics, but you actually end up saving more than that 5% of oil because plastics make cars and airplanes so much lighter that you save so much fuel, you're saving more than the 5% of oil that was used to make the plastic. The same thing when you protect food, the same thing when you insulate your house. You have so much less burning of coal and oil to insulate your house because of the plastic insulation. So the net effect of plastic on oil consumption is to reduce oil consumption and carbon dioxide. And yet these green groups never tell you that. They only look at one side. They only ever tell you about the use. They never tell you about the reduction because it doesn't suit their purposes. Here's something I put up on LinkedIn just as a, I mean, this is really ugly. I redrew this from a book. Literally, everything I do is done by hand, right? That's why it's so ugly. So all of these are drawn in PowerPoint because this is an old black and white book and it looked even more grotesque than my graph, right? So I found this in a book, I redrew it, and I put it up on LinkedIn. It got 280,000 views. It went viral, right? Because although I've been telling people that plastic is made of, this is the oil that's going into the plastic, the dark bar, and the light one is the amount of oil that's burned for energy to make the material. So what we see is that although oil is going into the plastic, it's still using vastly less oil than these other materials. So the total fossil fuel burned to make magnesium and aluminium and glass and zinc and steel is more than all these plastics, right? Oil is going into the final product in these cases, but the overall oil used is much, much less than all the other materials. And nobody's talking about it. People say plastics are bad because of greenhouse gas, so let's look at that. Materials usage is responsible, or creating materials is responsible for about 25% of all greenhouse gas, so that is a big thing. And here's a graph, I had my wife do this, from one of the most prestigious studies in a science magazine recently, and it looked at all materials here, so that's 25% of all greenhouse gas. Here's metals, here's cement, limestone and plaster, there's paper, and here's plastics. So if anyone was genuinely interested in reducing greenhouse gas, they'd have to be insane to be focused on plastics. Plastic production is responsible for 0.5% of greenhouse gas production, and as I said, plastics use reduces that by a greater amount than the 0.5 created by making the plastic in the first place. I mean, I'm a problem solver, right? Somebody comes to me and says, I'm worried about CO2 and greenhouse gas. Am I going to be focused on this one, or this one, or this one, or am I going to obsess about this one, which is barely even on the graph, and think that I've done my job? You cannot solve problems by ignoring 99% of them. And here's a statement, and as I said, everything's in inverted commas here, so it's literally copied and pasted. When it comes to greenhouse gas, the big five are iron, steel, aluminium, concrete, plaster, paper, and cardboard. No mention of plastic, because it's not even a thing. One thing that drives me nuts a little bit is people worry about all this packaging and how there's all this waste. And people seem to have some sort of packaging amnesia, right? You get a product, let's say you've ordered an iPhone and it comes and it's all perfect, right? Because it's been in good packaging. You open it up, you've got your $1,000 iPhone, and you throw this stuff in the trash can, you go, hey, what's up with all that packaging? What a waste, right? And it's like you've forgotten that 2 minutes before, it was the thing that delivered safely your product to your hand and avoided, because when things break and things don't get delivered safely, that's horrible for the environment. And that's what we see here. If you look at the influence of packaging on greenhouse gas compared to the overall effect of food, for example, packaging is only 3% of the total impact compared to the food. That means, and in the case of steaks, it's 0.5%. So if you take a steak and you're saving one steak in 200, you've already paid for all of that packaging, environmentally speaking, right? Or if it makes the steak last a little bit longer, it's in your fridge, you don't have to throw it out because the packaging was saving it. And people forget to realize that packaging is an extremely low proportion of the impact. It's actually saving much more than what you're spending, environmentally speaking, on the packaging. And here's a summary of that. So on average, packaging of food saves 5 to 10 times more CO2 than was used to make the packaging in the first place. People always ask me, well, all this recycling stuff, can you recycle plastics? And if you do, is it green? And the answer is yes. So this is mechanical recycling. So we've already seen plastics is the proven greenest solution in almost every case. And if you recycle it, the energy goes down from 80 down to 10. So you're saving 70% of your energy right there. And in some polymers, you're saving 90% by just mechanically recycling, which is done on standard machinery. Everybody knows how to do it. So mechanical recycling is green, and it does work on most polymers. You just have to sort them first. There's also this thing about plastics not being infinitely recyclable, and nothing is. If anyone tells you aluminium or glass is infinitely recyclable, that's just not true. I checked that as well. Paper is recyclable 3 to 7 times. Polypropylene is recyclable. They have done it 30 times, but it's only got good properties for about 5 times. HDPE, they recycled it through an extruder 50 times. It was good for about 10 times. And LDPE went through an extruder 100 times, and it still had great properties for the first 40 recyclings. So incredibly green, and these numbers can be improved upon if you put the right stabilizers in them. So this is not as good as it can get. This is just as good as it is right now with standard formulations. So yes, it is easy to mechanically recycle. It works on most plastics, and we're not waiting for chemical recycling to save us, because this is already working now and has been used for decades. Another huge misconception is that we are waiting for recycling to make plastics green. As we know now, that's not true. Regular virgin plastic is greener than any alternative we have. So here's virgin plastic at the current recycling rate over there. With zero recycling, it's still much greener than the alternative materials, right? So people criticize plastics because they're not being recycled enough, and that's a fair criticism, but there are reasons why that's the case. And even if it is the case, we're still doing the greenest thing we can do. It's greener than the other options. Winston Churchill once said that democracy is the worst form of government apart from all the other ones we've tried. And it's the same thing here, right? Everything we do makes an impact, but we have to pick the thing that makes the least impact, and that's almost always plastic. Here's an interesting correlation I found out, because people ask me, why aren't plastics recycled more? And what I found out in my studies is that the worst materials for the world are gold, platinum, and palladium. They create the most environmental havoc of any materials in the world, and they're also the most expensive materials. There's a correlation between what's expensive and what's bad for the environment. Why? Because expensive things need more energy to make, that you have to process more material, you have more transportation, you have more CO2, you have more environmental mess to clean up. So the same things that make things expensive tend to make them environmentally bad. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have things like limestone, which is is a raw material for PVC and a lot of polyolefin formulations. You have plastic and concrete, things which are so green and so cheap that they're not really economical to recycle. It's harder to make money. It can be done, but it's harder to make money recycling them. And so that's the fundamental reason. It's not some great conspiracy from the plastics industry to not recycle enough. It's just that nobody's throwing gold rings away, right, and failing to recycle them. They take them and they even take the pins off of your computer chips and dissolve them off. That's an actual thing. They take that 10 microns of gold, dissolve it off, and make sure that they save it, because gold is so expensive, because it's so bad for the environment. And plastics is on the other end of the spectrum, where it's harder to make money recycling. And here's an overall table which summarizes the environmental impact of all the different materials that we use. And this is a comparison. So is it the greenest solution when other alternatives are available? So concrete is surprisingly not that bad for the environment, but it's incredibly impactful when it comes to CO2 and materials usage. And recycling rates are low. Why? Because concrete's cheap and green and it's not worth recycling. And so we see overall here, if anyone was worried about materials use, if they're worried about CO2, they would be not focused on plastic, because these other materials are having a hugely greater impact than plastic does.
Could I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Last slide, please.
Yeah.
So this is the cost to recycle.
That's the cost of the material itself.
The cost to recycle.
Not to recycle, just to buy the material.
To buy the material.
Yeah. The virgin material.
So it's $1,000 per plastic, it's $1,000 per ton.
Yeah.
And what
That's an
kind of
average.
plastic? Is this average?
Yeah, I kind of average polypropylene, polyethylene, PET, just to get a more or less number. I mean, these numbers change day by day, as you know, on the spot market. You could get a different number every day, but just to give an idea.
So are you saying that because the cost is low, I mean, the price is low, so it's less incentive to recycle?
Yes. So basically, the things that are greenest are the cheapest, and it's harder to make money recycling them. So you do see companies making money recycling, but you also see, even last week, companies going out of business because the spot price changes overnight. They're profitable this week. They're losing money the next week. So it's hard to continuously make money recycling. And that's the thing. People are saying the plastics industry lied to them, that they knew that recycling wasn't really economical, that it would never really work. And that's not the case. It's just down to, as you know, you can only do things that make money, right? You can't do things that don't make money. So this is the problem, that it's harder to make money recycling plastic.
So would it be helpful if you have another column there that says cost to recycle?
I do have some data on that. It's a good idea. Yeah, I'm preparing a slide exactly on that.
Okay.
So for example, if you recycle concrete, it turns out to have no net benefit whatsoever. You don't help the environment by recycling concrete. So what about this litter thing, right? So people say, all right, it's the greenest solution and we're not drowning in it and blah, blah, blah. What about the litter? And people have studied that too. So here's what it looks like on a beach where people go, right? And this is how people behave. They find a beautiful beach, they go to it, and they make it look like this, and then they say, oh, that's ugly, and then they go to the next beach and do the same thing to it, right? They've literally studied it. And they literally analyze this litter on the beach, and you can find out, like there's a beach in Brazil, and all the litter is like these little kebab sticks, because that's what they eat in Brazil, in that area, right? So the beach litter turns out to come from the people on the beach. And ironically, this is the kind of beach we see, right? If you go on a holiday, you're going to a tourist beach, right? By definition, it's a beach you can get to, it's a beautiful beach with an airport nearby. If you look at a beach that is not frequented by people, you see this. This is Henderson Island. And what do you see? Nothing. There's almost nothing there. And when you do find something, it's like a fishing net. But there's none of that nonsense that we saw at the other tourist beach. So we have a very distorted picture about litter because we're going to beaches which are visited by people, right? And we don't see all of these other beaches which don't have any people on them, and they don't have any litter either, and they don't have any plastic. So we're getting a distorted image about where this litter is coming from. And scientific studies have literally proven, so you can see on the left here, this is the amount of litter that's coming from the beach users. And then you get a little bit from, on the right there, you can see there's a little bit coming from fishing nets and stuff like that. So this is not just supposition, this is actually proven that the litter on tourist beaches is coming from the tourists, and the factor that mainly influences it is how easily can people get to that beach. And another misconception is that this plastic pollution is just coming from nowhere. And what they found out is that all this plastic pollution is actually local litter. Just like we saw on the tourist beach. People are dropping it in a certain place, and then it's going out into the water and being washed up onto the shore. So all of this is local. It's not some global plastic problem. It's all local litter, and in some areas people are very bad with how they manage their waste and littering, and in other areas like Singapore, they don't have an issue. You never see litter. So it's down to human behavior. Not blaming materials or companies doesn't make sense. And here's a very powerful example, which is in the book. So they've been printing 8 billion plastic banknotes every year for decades. Australia has plastic banknotes. Several other countries have plastic banknotes. 8 billion a year. That's one for every person on the planet every year for 30 years. And how many do you see? I don't see any on the floor. I'd love to see some of this litter around on the floor. Or when I go for a walk with my wife, or when I go to the beach. Imagine you go to the beach and the money's just washing up floating on the water. It would be tremendous. But for some reason, as soon as this little piece of plastic has a value, nobody drops it, right? And that's another proof that this is caused by people and their behavior. As soon as that has a value, either because it's money or because you put a deposit on it, like they do on bottles, then suddenly it all comes back and nobody drops it because now it has a value. It's the same with credit cards. The average American has over 2 credit cards in their wallet, and I've yet to see one on the floor. And if there was one dropped, it would magically clean itself. So are we harming the animals? And here's a picture of a horribly photoshopped picture of a turtle with a bag around its neck. Is that true? So the way that I do these searches looking for scientific studies is I go to Google and I literally type in the words turtle mortality study. Somebody who was dishonest would look for, please show me studies that show that plastics aren't nasty to turtles, right? That would be cheating, but that's not how proper scientists work. You type in turtle mortality study, and it shows you the scientific studies, peer-reviewed studies of what is actually killing turtles. And the answer is shrimp trawling, fisheries, collision with boats, dredging, and other. So if anybody, it doesn't even mention plastic anywhere, right? Nothing about plastic bags, nothing about plastic. If somebody was actually concerned about turtles, they would be focused on these things. But these green groups are not focused on turtles, right? If they cared about turtles, they would be doing something about these things, but they're not. Same thing with whales. Not a single mention of the word plastic or bag in any study on whale deaths. Not one mention. You literally get the PDFs and search for the word plastic or bag, 0 hits, because it's not a thing. They're just trying to make us feel bad that we're harming the whales because it's the easiest way to get us to open our wallets and make donations to their causes. So and these are, look how many studies these are. So that's not a problem either. And you could say that some of it is entanglement in plastic fishing nets, but it's the same thing no matter what the net is made of. It's not the fault of the net, the plastic that the net is made of plastic. It's because somebody dropped it in the ocean. It would be the same if it was an old-fashioned rope net. And birds, we see that 100 million birds are killed every year in America by cats, right? So if you're worried about birds, put a bell on your cat, right? There's no mention of the word plastic or bag in any of these studies either. So there's another study that says it's even higher. They say it's 2 billion birds killed every year in America by cats. So this is the lower estimate. And we hear a lot about these wind turbines killing birds, but you see the number is very, very low compared to other things. One thing we hear about ocean plastics is there's 10 million tons going in every year, and that it's increasing exponentially. And both of those factors are wrong. This is a claim made by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation that we're going to have more plastic than fish in the ocean by 2050. That was disproven by the BBC, by the CBC, and more recently by me. So the 10 million tons a year number was a guess made by somebody called Jambeck. They said, let's take a map of the world. We'll assume that a certain percentage of all plastic within 35 miles of the ocean is going to jump in the plastic. That's the ocean-bound plastic that everyone keeps talking about. All plastic anywhere in the coastline in the world within 35 miles, some of it is going to jump in the ocean by itself. Apparently somebody invented a teleporter, like on Star Trek, that the plastic is going to grow legs and walk and swim to the ocean. So it was just a pure guess with no data. But now we have decades and decades of data with millions of measurements, and they never update the number. So the latest number for the amount of microplastic actually going into the ocean from rivers is 6,000 tons, not 10 million. And they've never updated the number, because as soon as they keep giving us this old guess all the time, they can give us a horrible, scary number and get donations from us based on something that's not true. It's been totally disproven. Would you rather believe a guess or 8 studies that say the exact opposite? And this is another important thing. You see this number? What's the amount of plastic outside the gyres? 0. So these gyres are areas where the water swirls around and you get a little bit more plastic in the rest of the ocean. But the rest of the ocean, so there's a concentration here, right? Slightly more plastic. But outside, there's no plastic. They can't even measure it in some areas. So it's very distorted to give you an idea and just talk about these gyres, which contain still very low levels of plastic when the total outside area is actually 0. So it's not 10 million tons a year, and it's not increasing exponentially. They've studied this, study after study after study shows no change for decades. And I've never seen a single group say that. And here's another one. So they say that this is an existential threat. It's the #1 threat to turtles, I read this week. It's just not true. These people looked at the actual amount of microplastics in the ocean, and they literally said it's negligible risk. It's so little that it poses no risk to any wildlife. And again, I put it in inverted commas because that's the word that they use. They said, this is how much it would take to be dangerous. This is how much there is, and it's just not enough to even be a problem. But that's not what we're hearing online. Here's another study where these ships have been going around with little nets behind them looking for plankton. And they've been doing this for, you can see, back since the 50s. These same nets and the same ships have been going round and round the world for decades. And they found out that plastic in the ocean, this is bigger pieces of plastic now, not microplastic. So it's bigger pieces like just a little chunk like that, 5 millimeters or something. So it goes around and around. Every now and then they detect a piece of plastic and they make a record of that. So they've been doing it for years with the exact same method. And we found out that the amount of plastic in the ocean went up from 0. It went up over a period of a couple decades, and then it leveled off. There's been no increase for years. And these amounts are so low that this ship would have to go around the world 4 times to pick up 1 plastic bag. Imagine sailing 100,000 miles, so because 25,000 miles around the world, right? So you sail a ship around the world 4 times to find 1 piece of plastic bag. And we're being told that the ocean's, choking in plastic bags and the wildlife is dying, and it's just not the case. The measurements don't back it up. We're told that plastics don't degrade, and every plastic scientist knows that that's not true. The annual market for plastic stabilizers is $5 billion a year. No one would be spending $5 billion a year on stabilizers for a material that didn't degrade, right? It would be financial insanity for any company to be spending money to stabilize something that was stable. So, and here we see that people have done studies on these PET bottles, which the World Wildlife Fund and all these other green groups claim is, without evidence, are going to take hundreds of years to degrade. And scientists say no, they degrade really rapidly, huge degradation already over the first 5 years, which means it's fragmenting into little pieces, and it continues to degrade faster and faster until it's completely gone. And no environmental group talks about this, although it's been measured by scientists. Same thing with bags. So they tell you that these bags take hundreds of years to degrade outside. Peer-reviewed science says that it degrades in less than 1 year. Right? Actual measurements on actual bags outdoors, they never tell you that. The science is done, it's reported, it's solid, multiple studies, and there's no mention of it to the media or to the public. And then they'll say, well, okay, maybe it does degrade by oxidation, but what about biodegradation? Plastics don't biodegrade. And that's not true either. There's hundreds of studies about biodegradation of polyethylene and polypropylene. Bacteria are able, it's a little bit slower, but bacteria are able to degrade these materials because they're just like oil, but with a longer chain, a longer molecular chain. So bacteria, 4% weight loss, 9% weight loss over a very small period, like 26 days. And the more it fragments and the smaller it gets, the easier it can biodegrade as well. On the other hand, if you're making a pipe and you don't want something to degrade, you can put in more stabilizers and better stabilizers and keep it stable for 50 years or 100 years. So thin, disposable things like bags, which have a very, they're throwaway materials basically. You use them once and dispose of them. Nobody's going to pay money to put the best stabilizers in those, and they're very thin. So if you drop them outdoors, they fall to pieces in a year. If you take a pipe and you want it to last longer, you put in better and more stabilizers, last for decades. And that's greener. Greener things last for longer, because you only have to spend the energy once to make them, and then they last again and again and again. So you don't have to replace them. So do we eat a credit card worth of microplastics a week? That's what the World Wildlife Fund claimed. And a newer study, which is independent and not funded by the World Wildlife Fund, said no, that's going to take 20,000 years to do. And I'll come on to that in a second. So what they've done here is they've made up a scary word called microplastics, right? Everybody knows that we're surrounded by dust, right? We breathe dust in with every breath, and we always have done since we were cavemen and cavewomen, right? It's not a surprise, and we're not even scared about dust, even though we are breathing it in, and even though it can be dangerous. So, and what's this dust made of? It's made of micro wood, it's made of micro glass, it's made of micro quartz and micro metal and micro paper, right? All of the things that we know degrade to particles, right? They're portraying plastics as being bad because they degrade to particles, but every solid we have degrades to particles. If I take a leaf and put it in the ground, what happens to it? It fragments into particles. What happens if I have a rock? It becomes a smaller rock, and then it becomes sand, and then it becomes dust. How have they been able to trick everyone into saying plastics are bad because they degrade to particles when every single solid does the exact same thing? It's just illogical. And if you do a search for any of these words, micro wood, micro metal, micro glass, on Google, you get 0 hits, right? Because it isn't a thing, it's dust, right? So plastic is a part of dust and a very tiny fraction of it. But the green groups have done a great job of branding it as something more scary. So as I said, the latest study shows that microplastics are 0.001% of particles that we breathe, and tested and proven not to be dangerous. Said to be insignificant. One thing that these microplastic studies, the ones that do claim nasty things, they're always cheating, right? So what they do is they take microplastic, they use 1 million times too much of it compared to what's actually in the environment. They take a special type of polystyrene, which doesn't actually exist in the environment. They soak it in poison to get a bad result, and they never compare it to any other kind of particle. So I look for studies saying, hey, okay, let's look at plastic and compare it. How toxic is it compared to other things that we know about? And here's an example, right? This is a study where some professional scientists finally compared plastic to something else, and they said, all right, let's compare it to clay, which is dirt, right? Let's compare it to cellulose, which is what plants and trees are made of. They compared it and said, plastic is safe just like cellulose, just like clay, just like all these other materials. Not a danger at all. And this is what proper scientists do. You compare it to something else and you use reasonable concentrations, not 1 million times too much. So here's an example of what's in dust, right? Very, very small proportion of it is plastic. It's tested and proven to be non-toxic. What else is in this dust? Cement, coffee dust, metal dust, all somewhat harmful. Quartz, which is 40% of dirt, outdoors, causes cancer in humans, proven. Wood dust causes cancer in humans. Leather dust causes cancer in humans. Soot dust, you know, when you're burning your car or you're burning smoke or something, burning wood or something like that, causes cancer in humans. This is the other things that are actually in dust, which are actually proven to be dangerous. Nobody's talking about them. And that's the problem with obsessing over something that's not a problem. You end up ignoring the real problems. So who's been manipulating us into all of this stuff? I think you've got a clue already. Here's a comparison of what these environmental groups are telling us and what the science says. So the environmental groups tell us when it comes to materials, we're drowning in it, and the problem is plastic. But science says it's concrete, wood, and metals, because that's the majority of materials. They tell us that we're drowning in plastic waste, but that's not what the science says. The same with CO2, same with fossil fuel, same with ocean plastics. They tell us it's huge and exponential, and it isn't. It's low and constant. On every single topic that I've investigated, the so-called green groups have lied to us. And even the former president of Greenpeace, Dr. Patrick Moore, he quit. And he said, these guys have abandoned science along with the other green groups, and they just tell you lies for money. That's his claim. They'll tell you any lie to get your donation, according to him. And he's written 2 books and a report about it. That's their actual business strategy. And the trouble is, these are the people in front of Congress. These are the people in front of our politicians who believe that they have good intentions. And they've abandoned all of that decades ago. And you can see it because the stuff that they're saying just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. So this is something that I've invented. I want to have this made into a sticker, and the next time Beyond Plastics or one of these groups comes up with a bunch of nonsense, I'm going to get this sticker and stamp it on their report and say, you've been green fleeced. These people are telling you things which are not true, and they should be ashamed of themselves. So the media's been part of this, right? Because if the media did their job like they did in the old days, they would have checked this stuff, and they wouldn't be repeating nonsense from any green group who claims something. But the media are not doing their job. So they studied microplastics. They looked at all the publications, and they found that about 20% of the scientific studies said there could be a problem. But when the media reported it, 93% of their articles say that there's definitely a threat from plastics. So if you look at the science on the one hand, minority says that there's a problem, and you look at the overwhelming number of media articles says that there's a definite problem. Because there's no easier way to get a donation than to scare somebody or to get a click if you're a newspaper or a magazine. You just scare people, and they want to see that story. And they've studied that too. If you were to lose $10, I would have to give you $20 to make you feel as good as to compensate for the bad feeling you got from losing 10. So bad news is twice as strong as good news. And that's why they're able to capitalize on this. They'll just tell you anything to get your advertising and your clicks on the internet. Scientifically proven that they've misled us. And here's an example. This was on LinkedIn. And I actually wrote, I said to the BBC, I told them, this is a photoshopped image. Here's the original with no bag. I mean, this is useless. Look at this. Anyone can see that that's not real. There's never been a turtle found with a bag around its neck in the history of the world. Right? So I wrote to them, and I said, look, and I said that there's 10 million tons of plastic going into the ocean a day. That's wrong as well. So I wrote to them, and they actually updated the image to be this one, and they updated the number to be 10 million tons a year, which is still wildly wrong, but it's 365 times better than their number that they had before. And the same with the USA Today. They wrote this thing, they took the Beyond Plastics report, and they ran with that and said plastic pipes are bad, you should be using copper pipes. I wrote to that journalist and said, you've been tricked into misinformation, and she published an update article the following Monday saying, hey, this is not the real story. I showed her all the evidence that you're about to see about pipes, and that plastic pipes are the best. So let's talk about pipes. Here's a study about pipes comparing copper to cross-linked polyethylene, one of the other common types of pipes. And you can see that the copper is in black, they're worst. And this is the impact on the right in blue of the plastic compared to the copper. So vastly less impact on the environment. In ozone, in photochemical, in effect on rivers, on CO2. As I said, there are many factors in a life cycle analysis, and every single one of them, copper is vastly more harmful than plastic. I'm very thorough when I do a study, so I found, as I said, 14 studies in the world. I think that's all the ones that have ever been done on pipes. I'm going to show you all of them quickly. So here's a comparison of polypropylene pipe, and on the right, ductile iron. So you see again, the little blue bars are the impact of the polypropylene plastic pipe, and on the right is the ductile iron. The plastic is vastly less harmful in every single category than iron pipes. What about the next study? Here's one from Geberit in Germany, and here we have PVC pipe, PP, HDPE pipe, compared to cast iron pipe, vastly lower impact from the plastic pipes. Here's another one. Different diameters of pipes this time. We see PVC and HDPE, there on the left, have vastly lower impact than ductile iron and steel. What about the next one? Same thing again. We've got HDPE and PVC compared to ductile iron, and we can see that, again, the plastic pipes are causing least impact in every single thing you can measure. What about the next one? And this one's interesting because it's got PVC and HDPE, which are already two of the greenest solutions. And then we have the orientated PVC, which you guys know all about. That's even greener, right? Because you're stretching the plastic, you're making it stronger, you can use less material, and you end up having less impact because you've got less material, you've got a better product. So that's even greener than the two greenest options that we knew before. So your company is definitely on the right track when it comes to that. Here's another one. PEX pipes are greener in every category you can think of. I'm whizzing through these because you guys will all get copies of the slides anyway, and it's only to show you that every single study agrees. So this is how much improvement the plastic pipe has over the metal pipe. And you can see it's 100% improvement in human health, cancer effects, global warming 40% better than the metal pipe, the copper pipe, and so forth. So why is Beyond Plastics, a company that pretends to be or claims to be an environmental group, why are they telling us to use copper pipe when every study ever done says that it's vastly more harmful for the environment? Whenever you want to know what somebody's real motives are, compare their words to their actions. Why would an environmental group, if they were genuine in their cause and they weren't paid off by the copper industry or had some other motive, why would they be telling us to use a pipe which is massively more impactful than the plastic pipes are? It doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't they have done a study? You can literally type LCA pipe into Google and you will find these studies that I found. Why didn't they do that if they really care about the environment? We don't know for sure, but it certainly looks suspicious. Here's another one, UPVC pipe compared to steel and copper. Again, you see that the impact of the PVC pipe is massively less than the copper pipe there and the iron pipe here. So these studies are all coherent, and that's why I find so many studies, right? I want to know, is somebody playing a fast one? Is someone playing a trick on us? Or do all these studies agree? Here's another study showing PVC and HDPE as greener than ductile iron. Here's one that has some different effects with compares fiber reinforced and clay. Concrete turns out to be rather a green option for these very thick sewer pipes, but it has some problems because it's brittle, and if you have seismic activity in the area, it breaks and causes problems. But concrete is not as bad for the environment as I thought in some applications. And here's another one, again, where you see very low impact compared to the steel pipe, for example, is in gray, and the plastic pipes, again, causing less impact. And another one. HDPE pipes are the greenest according to this study. And this one. And here's an exception. Here's a study by the ductile iron people that claims that their pipe is greenest. So we've now seen 13 studies that all agree that plastic pipes are the greenest, and suddenly the Ductile Iron Pipe Institute has come up with a study that says that steel is greener or iron is greener. So what about it? If you read how they did this study, they assumed that their pipes last 100 years and the plastic pipes have to be dug up and replaced every 50 years. So that's how they came to this conclusion. They didn't provide good evidence for their assumption. They basically went against every other study ever done in the history of mankind and found a way to make their pipes come out on top. So that's why you need to download 14 studies, so you can see whether the study from the people with a vested interest is consistent. If you look at the studies from TEPFA, which I showed, or the PPI, for example, those are consistent with all the independent peer-reviewed studies from independent universities and so forth. So they seem to be valid because they're giving the same message. If we look at this one, it's a clear outlier, and they've made assumptions which are not really valid. The Beyond Plastics people said that we should be worried about plastics because they contain additives, and that's not really true either. So if you look at BPA, that's not even a thing in most of these applications we're talking about. They're talking about phthalates in the PVC pipe, but PVC pipe's made of unplasticized PVC. That means it has no phthalates in it. They're talking about things which are not even in there. And there's other examples of PET and non-intentionally added things. They basically come up with any way they can to scare you into not using plastic pipes. They also complain that PVC creates dioxins, which is an unfair claim as well. If you type in the word dioxin EPA into Google, you will find this page with this graph. And what does it show? Who's making the most toxic dioxins? Oh, the metals industry, the very same people who are criticizing the plastics people this week on LinkedIn, saying that we're creating the dioxins when it's, you know, if they're worried about dioxins, they should be looking at their own problems. This is the iron and copper people. But no, they'd rather point the finger elsewhere. They also had this, you see this, it says a baffling source of contamination. So they claim that plastic pipes are bad because if there's a forest fire, there's going to be stuff in your water and it's coming from the pipes. They didn't have any evidence for it, and they're basically saying, this is just so baffling. Where is all this benzene coming from? We don't get it. So I looked up what forms when you burn a tree. You're in a forest fire, right? There's 10,000 trees burning around, and you're getting 1 gram of benzene for every kilogram of tree you're burning, right? And they're like, oh, it's so baffling. Where is this contamination coming from? Like the 10,000 trees that are burning, maybe? It's like never occurred to them to look that up. So this is two scientific studies saying that what do you get when you burn wood in a forest fire? You get benzene. It's not coming from the plastic pipes. It's coming from the millions of trees that are burning. But of course, that would be the last thing that they'd want to tell us because it doesn't suit their agenda. So here's a comparison of pipes. And one thing I found out is that copper pipe's not actually that as safe as they claim. It's only safe at neutral pH. If you run plastic pipe testing is done at 3 different pHs, and plastic pipe passes at all 3 pHs, acidic and neutral and basic. If you do the same thing for copper, it only passes at pH 7, that's neutral pH. As soon as you run it in acidic or basic conditions, so much copper dissolves out that it's unsafe. It's unsafe levels of copper, and guess what? Beyond Plastics never mention it. They claim to be worried about things coming out of pipes, they claim to be worried about human safety, and when you look at it, you find out that the plastic pipes are way safer, and there are literally documented cases of copper poisoning from this happening. Plus, of course, the pipe dissolves and leaks and all the rest of it. The other thing they didn't mention is this is taxpayers' money, right? Congress has promised $15 billion to replace lead pipes. And that's why people are clamoring to get this $15 billion. That's why they're all coming out of the woodwork, I assume, and making these accusations. But if you look at the price of these different pipes, the plastic pipe is like 5 times cheaper than the copper pipe, and the iron pipe. And you can check that on Home Depot. So why would you recommend using something that's less green, not as safe, and costs 5 times more when it's coming out of our pockets through our taxes? So in conclusion, we should use less materials. We should try to create less waste. We should try and create less CO2. Using alternative materials is not a good idea because being responsible, after using less material and recycling it, we should be looking at all the options, picking the thing that's greenest. Sometimes that will be wood, but in almost every case, it will be plastic. So suggesting options which are scientifically certain to increase harm is not clever. Litter is solved by changing people's behavior, and that's done by education, scientifically proven. Education, deposit systems so that the litter has a value, and fines. The NGOs who are advising Congress, advising the government, advising the public and being believed are corrupt, according to their own former members who are leaving and saying, these guys are not telling you the truth. The media is unreliable. They're just printing everything for the most part. And so harmful policies come out. They ban these bags, and then they check the science and realize, oh, that actually increased harm, and they have to reverse all the bans. So a clever politician would check the science before they made policy decisions so that they don't have to embarrassingly go back and reverse their decision. And this focus on plastic, which is less than 1% of everything, ensures that we will never make any real progress. That's the saddest part of all. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone and open the floor for questions.